Do you have any relationship with the Russian state? Have you ever been invited to do anything on behalf of the Russian state?
No, hang on a minute. No. Listen to me. You've come on here and tried to gotcha my guest.
I think you asked me a question that you knew the answer to in a bid to cast doubt on my credibility. That's what I believe you're trying to do. I think you knew the answer to your question.
But this is the whole...
Let me just make this point, Bev.
No, hang on, but this is the whole point. I do want to push you on that because this is the whole point. Whilst we ignore this Russian threat perception, as Aaron just said, we simplify this debate.
You've just accepted then that NATO was not a threat to Russia. So that excuse, excuse and apology for the invasion is immediately burnt away in your own words.
You can threaten a country in ways different than invading it. Look at, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, that was a major threat to the US.
And do you seriously think that Putin thought that America was going to start a nuclear war with Moscow? Come on, man, get a grip. The sort of stuff you've just come out with I'm sure will be welcomed in the Kremlin's press office.
I was quoting the European Union, so don't twist my words.
Hello and welcome to today's main debates from GBN Originals. I'm Bev Turner and we've got a crucial discussion ahead of us. So it's one that goes beyond the headlines and sound bites to examine the real costs and consequences of Europe's deepening involvement in the Ukraine war. So from the very start of Russia's invasion in 2022, European leaders have presented their support for Ukraine as a moral imperative, standing up for sovereignty, democracy and international law. But as the war drags on, the financial and strategic stakes have only escalated. The UK has pledged to spend 2.5% of its GDP on defence by 2027, while Germany and France are pouring billions into military aid. Just last month, European leaders approved another multi-billion euro package for Kiev, reinforcing Europe's commitment to Ukraine's defence, but at what cost? Supporters of this strategy argue that bolstering Ukraine's resistance is essential, not just for Ukraine's survival, but for Europe's own security. They warn that failing to stop Putin now could embolden future aggression and that investment in military deterrence is the price we must pay for long-term stability. But critics are raising serious questions. They point out that this war has become a bonanza for the arms industry, with massive government contracts going to defence firms, sometimes with very little oversight. They're also asking whether Europe's priorities have been distorted. Are we spending billions on war while public services struggle, while inflation hits households, while diplomatic efforts to end the conflict remain weak? So, is Europe's military spending on Ukraine a necessary investment in security? Or are we being drawn into an endless and costly proxy war? Well, to debate this today, we've got two formidable voices. Aaron Maté is a journalist known for his critical reporting on Western foreign policy, and he argues that NATO's role in this war has prolonged the conflicts rather than paved the way for peace. And Matthew Stadlen, broadcaster and commentator, who believes that supporting Ukraine is not just the right thing to do, it is essential for the future of European security. So where does the truth lie? Let's get into it. Let me start with you, Aaron, if I may. You have spoken out about what you see as a one-sided narrative in the media. We're certainly encouraged to conclude that Putin is always evil and that Zelensky is a hero. What kind of criticisms do you get when you try to point out that maybe there is more to this sorry story than that?
Well, you don't really get criticisms. You get name calling dismissed as a Russian apologist, a Putin apologist. And that comes from people who I think don't want to look at the facts when the facts to me are very clear. The U.S. has led this coalition, this proxy war coalition, for a very long time. This conflict predates Russia's invasion. You can trace it back to the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was given an unwritten pledge that it would not expand further to the east. The U.S. and its allies immediately ignored that, and they decided it would be a good idea to include Ukraine, even though Ukraine, from Russia's historical perspective, is a very important country where there are millions of people who identify as ethnic Russians, and it's on Russia's border. And many diplomats, top officials from the U.S. and other countries have pointed out that bringing Ukraine into NATO would be an absolute disaster. But the Bush administration proceeded nonetheless to issue an invitation against the objections even of some people inside the Bush administration and Europeans as well, including Angela Merkel. Then you have the coup in 2014, the U.S. backing the overthrow of a government that was pledging neutrality to not join NATO, which, by the way, was in line with a majority of Ukrainian public opinion. And then you had a proxy war begin then, in which the U.S. took one side, Russia took the other. And there were reasonable opportunities to avoid all of this in something called the Minsk Accords, which were undermined. We can talk about why, culminating finally in Russia's invasion in 2022. And when you try to point out some of the background to this, that Russia's invasion, I don't think it was justified, but I certainly think it was provoked. You're dismissed as being somehow an apologist for Putin, when really, I think we're acting in the interest of everybody, including Ukrainians, because even top U.S. officials admit now that Ukraine is being used not for the goal of defending Ukraine, but to bleed Russia. And why would we want to invest so much money, so much blood and treasure just to weaken a geopolitical rival that has nuclear weapons? It's folly, and there are reasonable political solutions on the table, from the Minsk Accords to the Istanbul Accords, which were brokered in early 2022. But after the U.S. and UK opposed them, Zelensky walked away. And that was a very reasonable opportunity to end the war then and save hundreds of thousands of lives.
Okay. Matt, do you see that version of history as being clear provocation for the invasion in 2022? And do you think we ever hear that in the British media, at least?
Well, we hear it because we all have access to the things that Aaron has just been saying, but I don't recognise it. Of course, Western foreign policy has been anything but blemish-free, and it's perfectly reasonable to have a conversation or a discussion or a debate as to whether Western strategy in regards to Russia has been effective. But let's make no bones about this. Putin is a war criminal. He's effectively a dictator, because if you look at what he does to his political opposition, he just obliterates them or has them murdered. And he invaded a sovereign democracy in the shape of Ukraine, not once, but twice. And Russian forces are currently occupying 5 Ukrainian territories. Before I go any further, I'd just like to get a proper sense, if I may, and you're welcome to do so in return, Aaron, about you and who I'm actually debating with. Do you have any relationship with the Russian state? Have you ever been invited to do anything on behalf of the Russian state or speak on behalf of the Russian state?
I have no formal relationship with the Russian state. I've never worked for any Russian entity or worked with them. I was invited by Russia and China to address a UN Security Council briefing on another issue, the issue of chemical weapons in Syria, where I covered a cover-up at the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, of the chemical weapons in Syria. And I was invited to speak at a UN Security Council meeting about that.
I'm interested.
Okay, well, I would suggest that should be known by viewers and listeners to this podcast. Just one more quick question. As I say, please luckily we live in a democracy where dictators like Putin can't have us silent, so we could ask each other questions. Where do you stand on President Trump's desire to make your country, Canada, because I believe you're Canadian, the 51st state of America?
Do you know what? I'm going to step in there, Matt, because we can talk about that. But I'm interested to know your motivation for asking that question, because I think what you just did is what happens when you pretty much evidenced the point that I started with, which is that if somebody tries to offer a factual version of history, which might present the invasion as being somewhat provoked as opposed to coming out of the blue and into a peaceful eastern Ukraine in 2022. You play the man, not the ball. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you were trying to do there was to somehow discover that Aaron might have some sort of vested interest and to be working perhaps as an agent of Putin as opposed to debating the issue. Was that genuinely your intention, to find out if you had a vested interest?
What I think is really important, because some of your viewers and listeners won't know who I am and won't know who Aaron is that they have an idea of where we're both coming from and who we might or might not be beholden to. I hope I've helped a little bit on that route. But let me address substantively.
Well, hang
again,
on. Okay, well, let me ask you then, Matt, because this would never happen the other way around. Aaron might want to know, do you have connections to Ukraine that you would like to expose at this point in order to make your position credible? But you wouldn't.
No, listen, I don't care what his connections are. I'm not trying to impugn your credibility. I'm here to discuss an issue and debate the facts. And in my experience, when people don't have the facts on their side, they try to impugn the other person's credibility. That's what I believe you're trying to do. I think you knew the answer to your question. I think you knew that I've spoken at the UN on my own behalf, not on behalf of someone else. But yes, I was invited by Russia and China. So I think you asked me a question that you knew the answer to in a bid to cast doubt on my credibility. I don't really care who you are. I care what your argument is, and that's what I'm here to debate. And also, by the way, everything I said at the UN when I was invited by Russia and China, I stand behind 100%. And try to find a single person out there who's ever refuted it. They can't, because as is the case here, I believe also the facts are on my side.
Aaron, viewers and listeners can make their own assessment, and that's what I was trying to achieve by asking you those questions.
Did you know the answer to your question? Let me ask you. Did you know the answer to your question when you asked it?
I'd done some research, as I hope you did, about me before that suggested that. It wasn't for me to assert it, Aaron. I wanted to ask you and give you the opportunity to give your own answer.
Okay.
But Matt,
now you're being disingenuous, but it's fine. I don't care. I'm here to discuss the issue, so let's focus on that.
Disingenuous at all. I wanted to hear it from your mouth rather than just from my own research. But I'll answer your question, Bob, about Ukraine. Yes.
No, hang on a minute. No. Listen to me. You've come on here and tried to gotcha my guest. And I understand that when you're doing a debate, it is always, and I thank you for doing your research because it's important. I'd much rather you did your research on this. But I do find it interesting that you try to research the man rather than the issue. Why?
Do you think, Bev, it would be relevant if Aaron was a Russian, for example, or if he was employed by the Russian state? Do you think that would be material to our conversation? Do you think it might be my conversation if I were Ukrainian or I was working for the Ukrainian state? If I were, I would expect you to ask.
I'm not Russian. I've never worked for the Russian state. So it's. I mean, that would be relevant, but unfortunately, it's not true.
I'm glad we can agree on that. Let me answer your question about Ukraine, Bev, since you quite fairly asked me. I have no relationship with Ukraine, other than that it is a sovereign country on the continent in which I live, and I care very much that its borders are protected and defended.
Would you also then, Matt, accept Aaron's version of historical events, which is to say that we've been very much fed a NATO narrative about this situation, and that the facts about the treatment, let's say we haven't even really gone on to that, of the ethnic Russian people in the east of Ukraine, and the fact that there was 14,000 of them had already been killed before that invasion in 2022, and that it might be helpful in the pursuit of peace if we could also empathize with both sides of this. And it can also be true that Putin is a dictator, and it can also be true that he has blood on his hands. Those two things can be true at the same time. But if you were going to understand this situation and this conflict in its entirety, both narratives have to be understood, don't they, Matthew?
So I certainly don't feel I've been fed anything, because like you and like Aaron, I have access to information from right around the world, from all sorts of different media outlets. Social media, for all its faults, has democratized information, at least in Western democracies. Very different, of course, if you live in Russia. So I don't feel I've been fed anything. You mentioned 14,000 Russian deaths in eastern Ukraine. I haven't got those figures to my fingertips. I think we'd have to look into the context of those figures, assuming they're correct, and how those deaths came apart. But I remind everyone that Putin's Russia invaded first Crimea in 2014 when Barack Obama was president of the United States, and then invaded when Biden was president of the United States, the full-blown invasion of the Ukrainian main landmass in 2022. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who were just going about their business, going to gyms and cafes in Kiev and in other towns and cities across Ukraine until that day, perfectly free individuals, are now dead. Families have been torn apart and destroyed. Children, as we understand, have been kidnapped by Russia. There has been, as I've said, the takeover of sovereign Ukrainian territory, and a lot of civilians have been killed in this war. Those are the facts. And if we're looking at the history, let's look, for example, at 1994.
Well, let me just, I'm interested
Aaron,
but I want to
tell you about the history very quickly on the history. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons after the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, because it was given reassurances and it was told that Russia would not invade. What has happened since?
Aaron, just talk to me about the Crimea situation, because I hear this a lot as a news anchor when people say, well, if you look, Putin, he invaded Crimea and now he's invading Ukraine, and it's evidence of his expansionist ambitions, and he won't stop at Ukraine and he will go for Poland. And then the next thing you know, Bev, he'll be on the coast of England. Take me back to Crimea and what context you think that invasion should be understood in.
Let me first answer the nuclear weapons point that was just made, and then I'll take it to Crimea. Yes, Ukraine agreed to give up the nuclear weapons on its territory in 1994 in exchange for recognition that its sovereignty would be respected by both the U.S. and Russia. The problem is, though, that Ukraine never controlled those nuclear weapons. The command and control was in Moscow. So Ukraine was giving up nuclear weapons that it couldn't actually use, and it gave them up for a lot of financial inducements. Russia, by the way, argues that the Duma never ratified that agreement, so it's not void. But let's reject that argument because it is true that Russia did make that pledge. But the U.S. made a pledge then, too. The U.S. also pledged in Budapest 1994 to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. And this is my point here. In 2013, when the Maidan protests broke out, the U.S. did not respect Ukraine's sovereignty. You had a government, Yanukovych, that was, yes, it was corrupt, and many people were upset about that. But it was trying to maintain neutrality, which at the time was in line with the majority of Ukrainian public opinion, and also in line with Ukraine's declaration of state sovereignty, that Ukraine would be a neutral country and not joining any military bloc, including NATO or a Russian-led military bloc. The U.S. took advantage of the protests that broke out against Yanukovych, openly supported armed protests led by not peaceful protesters, but by far-right nationalists, including members of Svoboda, which the year prior, the European Union had condemned and said people should not associate with because it's led by essentially white supremacist, xenophobic anti-Semites. That culminated in the overthrow of Yanukovych, which the U.S. also supported. There was a power-sharing agreement reached to keep Yanukovych in power along with the opposition. But hard-right elements of the Maidan undermined that and basically led a violent overthrow of Yanukovych. It was after then that Russia then seized Crimea. After a new government came in where you had Svoboda and other far-right elements heavily represented, they were talking about immediately joining NATO. And they also declared, in one of their first moves after taking power, essentially a assault on the Russian language, trying to ban Russian as a language, essentially, from the state. And so Russia saw this, a coup government that was backed by the U.S., talking about joining NATO, talking about basically losing Russia's most important naval base in Crimea to NATO. Russia saw this as a threat. And by the way, a majority of Crimeans saw this as a threat as well. There was a referendum. It was dismissed by the U.S. as a sham. And it's true, it was held on unfair conditions. But if you read U.S. government-funded polls, a majority of Crimeans supported joining Russia because many people there consider themselves to be ethnic Russian. So it was in that context, in response to a violent coup in which the new coup government was threatening ethnic Russians inside Ukraine and also talking about joining NATO, thereby giving up Russia's historic naval fleet in the Black Sea, that Putin then took Crimea. It was a response. It was not an unprovoked land grab. That's my point.
Yeah. Matt, do you want to respond to that? Because it's very hard to hear all of that and think that any leader of any country under those circumstances where effectively a coup has been enacted by a foreign power, and there's that very powerful audio of Victoria Nuland talking at the time about the fact that, you know, they would kind of decide who was in control, just as she's handing out cookies in Maidan Square. It'd be very difficult for any leader to just sit on their hands and take that, wouldn't it?
So, I mean, Aaron, I hope you don't think I'm playing the man here again, but you'd obviously, coming out with the sort of stuff you've just come out with, I'm sure be welcomed in the Kremlin's press office. You, like me, I think, have Jewish heritage. And again, I'm not playing the man. I, like you, have no time or no truck with anti-Semitism. My grandparents were Jewish refugees from Vienna. The idea that Ukraine has been painted as some sort of anti-Semitic far-right state is straight out of Kremlin propaganda. Zelensky, as we know himself, and of course it's possible to have self-hating Jews, but Zelensky himself is Jewish. So let's not, please, parrot propaganda from the Kremlin. I'm not saying, by the way, guys, I'm not saying that the things are totally straightforward.
Just to clarify, I was quoting the European Union, which condemned Svoboda, which was the leader of the coup. Okay. I'm not saying that's all of Ukraine. I'm saying that was a major power player that the U.S. backed in the ouster of Yanukovych in 2014. So don't twist my words. And by the way, Barack Obama was a black president. It doesn't mean we've ended racism in the U.S.
No, but I think the idea that Zelensky is part of some sort of white supremacist or an anti-Semitic government in Ukraine
I didn't say he was.
But you're drip feeding the audience the sorts of things that Putin would love you to be.
You're twisting my word. I didn't say
let me make my wider point, if I may. I started off by saying, of course, Western foreign policy has not been blemish-free. We could go through numerous examples and we could have long conversations about each of them. I mean, just look at the Iraq War, for example, when, as we should have done in a democracy, we had not one, but at least two full investigations into the role that we played there. If you look at Ukraine, there's no doubt there will be, I'm sure, pockets of racism, pockets of white supremacy, pockets even of anti-Semitism. We know that there are certain countries in Europe that are further behind our country, Britain, when it comes to race relations, although we obviously have our own problems. But if you look at what happened in 2014, we shouldn't equivocate here. We shouldn't try to blur the lines. Russia invaded a sovereign country. And if the people of that part of the world, if the people of Crimea wanted to join Russia, then that becomes a very complicated situation, not entirely unanalogous to issues in Spain or in the United Kingdom. But what was completely unacceptable, quite obviously, was for Putin to invade Crimea and then to do so again in 2022.
So I'm interested, is there a line that you think would the West and NATO, let's say America, could cross that you might consider provocation? Should they be allowed to have all the countries on the border of Russia be in NATO? Should they be allowed to have American bases? No, because I'm genuinely interested.
Yeah, well, as you know, I mean, I don't know whether you studied geography yourself, but you will be aware that there are countries that neighbour Russia already that are part of NATO. So
correct.
Again,
but
our audience should be absolutely crystal clear about that. And they should also be crystal clear about a second very important reality.
Hang on.
And also, that is that
we should also be crystal clear that Putin has said repeatedly that the line in the sand for him would be Ukraine being part of NATO. And he's been saying that since the 90s. And that has gone unanswered. And Biden particularly was ambiguous on that.
Putin can say what he wants. And as I said earlier, we can have a conversation, and perhaps rightly so, about whether the West in any way made strategic errors in its relationship with Russia. None of that legitimized either of the invasions of Ukraine. And the second point I was about to make was we should be, to use that phrase again, crystal clear. NATO is not an offensive alliance. It is a defensive alliance. So for Putin to use NATO as an excuse to invade Ukraine, which as I understand it, he considers really part of Greater Russia anyway, is completely absurd and totally disingenuous. This is a man who cannot be trusted on anything. He breaks deal and agreement after deal and agreement. And if you talk to the people of Ukraine and you see the suffering that he has imposed upon them, you should share my view.
Do you feel that the West has played no part, Matthew, in leading us to this conflict, which, let's be honest, has damaged the Russian economy. It's put billions of dollars into the pockets of the arms manufacturers, and we know that plays a very important part of the global economy.
Bev, the person who's damaged the Russian economy on this is Putin. And he's, by the way, not just damaged the Russian economy, he has led to the deaths, to the slaughter in the meat grinder of tens and tens of thousands of Russians. Now, I'm not an absolutist on this. Of course, I think those Russians were legitimate targets, but they were also, no doubt, many of them forced to go to war by their dictator, warmongering president. And their deaths are therefore a tragedy. Although it's completely right that Ukraine has been fighting them off and trying to keep them out, their deaths and the suffering of their families as a consequence, of course, is a tragedy. They're forced to go to war. Or if they choose to go to war, it's because they've been fed a line by a president who controls the media in Russia. Bev, you and Aaron and I are incredibly fortunate that we live in societies in Canada and in Britain where we have a free media. And you're speculating that somehow there's a conspiracy that our arms manufacturers have been egging on this war and that this is somehow to boost our own economies. You can't provide a single shred of evidence for that suggestion.
Well, I can actually.
Go on, Aaron.
In the 1990s, the head of something called the Committee to Expand NATO, look it up. His name is Bruce Jackson. He was head of the group called the Committee to Expand NATO, which was lobbying Congress, Washington, to expand NATO. What was his day job? He was vice president for Lockheed Martin. He recognized accurately that the expansion of NATO, as it has done exactly, has opened up vast markets for weapons manufacturers, and they've made a lot of money off of these wars. I will agree with you, though, on one thing. Putin has major responsibility. I believe he was provoked. He didn't have to invade, though. I do not think he exhausted peaceful options to avoid an invasion. I do think, though, he was pushed into a corner. And as a citizen of the West, I'm from Canada, but I live in the U.S., so I'm a U.S. taxpayer. I'm responsible for my own government's actions. I have no influence in Russia. I've never been to Russia. We're not responsible for what Russia does. We're responsible for what our governments do. That's a basic premise of just being in a democracy, where I agree with you. We are fortunate to have the freedom to have debates like this. And our role, I think, has been disastrous. And since you accused me earlier of parroting Kremlin talking points on areas including Crimea, let me quote you someone from the inside of the U.S. government. Eugene Rumer, he served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia under Obama. And he said this about Crimea. Russian actions in Ukraine were entirely logical, perhaps even inevitable, as an extension of Russian threat perceptions. As seen from Moscow, the rapid changes in Ukrainian politics, the collapse of the presidency of Yanukovych, by which he means the overthrow, backed by the U.S., of Yanukovych, and the coming power of a political coalition advocating eventual membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, carried profound geopolitical consequences for Russia. They signaled the emergence of new threats to Russia's security right at its doorstep, threats that no Russian leader is likely to tolerate without a wholesale change in the country's ideology and understanding of its national security. So this is my point. You don't have to endorse Russia's invasion in 2022 or its annexation of Crimea, but from the point of view of Russian threat perceptions and security, as Obama's national intelligence officer for Russia recognized, all of this was a major threat. Now, you called NATO a defensive alliance. Well, tell that to the people of Libya, for example. Libya was not a threat to NATO. Libya was not a member of NATO, but yet NATO was used to destroy Libya. And look at it now. It's a classic failed state. A lot of people dead, two different competing governments laying claim to the country. And that's a result of the supposed NATO defensive alliance coming in with an intervention. Even the Clinton administration, when they advocated expanding NATO to Ukraine, they wrote a memo about this back in 1994. They said the goal of that would be what they called, quote, neo-containment of Russia. Nothing defensive about that. That's saying you're an adversary and we are going to contain you. And that's why, by the way, when even Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s talked about, seriously, Russia joining NATO, he was ignored. Because the point of NATO is not to defend its members, it's to expand U.S.-led hegemony and enrich arms manufacturers in the process. And Ukraine, unfortunately, has been used for that goal. And it's been a disaster foremost for Ukrainians, but also for the rest of the planet. Because we're talking now about a proxy war between the world's two top nuclear powers. And why, on top of sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people, both Ukrainian and Russian, would we want to fuel tensions between two countries that can destroy the world many times over?
Okay, Aaron, let me ask you a couple of very straightforward and quick questions, right? So if my threat assessment, my risk analysis involves thinking that you're going to fly through my computer screen and karate kick me in the face, so I send someone round to your office or your home in America and have you executed, do you think that's an acceptable, reasonable response?
No, it's not reasonable. But first of all, if you had installed a coup, if you had kicked me out of my house, changed the government that rules over me, banned my language, and talked about joining a hostile military alliance, that I would have grounds to feel threatened. And that's the part you're leaving out in your analogy.
Aren't you? Because you're getting confused because Ukraine, during the time that we're talking about, was a sovereign country. It didn't belong to Russia, did it? The idea that NATO, the idea that NATO,
hang on, let him just let
it didn't
Aaron
belong
just
to the US either. Yes. Okay. Sorry.
And we can have a conversation about the levels or not of American involvement in that. And as I keep coming back to what I was saying earlier, I am not a defender, right or wrong, for American or Western foreign policy. Where they get it wrong or we get it wrong, I call it out. Great advantage again of living in a democracy. Aaron,
but you're not.
One thing I don't think any of us. Let me just quickly make this point, Bev.
No, hang on. But this is the whole point. I do want to push you on that because this is the whole point. Whilst we ignore this Russian threat perception, as Aaron just said, we simplify this debate. And you can say, well, we can talk about what the West might have done. Yeah, we have to, because that's the part that's missing every time we talk about Russia and Ukraine. Putin evil, Zelensky a hero.
I'm going to respond to that right now, Bev.
You can't kick that away because
right now.
That's what people have done for decades, Matt.
I'm going to respond to that right now. There is only one person and one government that is responsible for the unlawful, illegal, murderous invasion of Ukraine, and that is Russia. Now, something I think probably all three of us can agree on is that Vladimir Putin is not stupid. He's a very
It doesn't matter if he is or not. I'm not bothered about his psychology. It doesn't care. It doesn't matter.
He's a very wily and clever and manipulative and evil operator. No one would call him stupid. The idea that he really thought, Aaron, that NATO was going to invade Russia is an insult to his intelligence. And you are insulting the intelligence. You're insulting the intelligence of our audience. If you are seriously,
I didn't say that.
If you're serious, let me clarify. Right. So you've just accepted then that NATO was not a threat to Russia. So that excuse, excuse and apology for the invasion is immediately burned away in your own words.
Matthew, let's be straight about what our words are, okay? There's a difference between threatening a country and invading it. I never said that NATO was going to invade Russia. But you can threaten a country in ways different than invading it. Look at, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, that was a major threat to the U.S. And that's the point here.
Aaron. Very, very weak ground. Do you seriously think that Putin thought that America was going to start a nuclear war with Moscow? Come on, man, get a grip.
No, I didn't say that either. But Putin did think that by expanding NATO, the U.S. and its allies were putting military infrastructure on Russia's borders that could threaten it. And they already have. They've built under the Bush.
Let me finish. You've rolled out a nuclear war. So what do you mean?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to answer you now. The U.S. has already installed so-called anti-missile defense sites in Poland and Romania. Okay, the official pretext for those sites is that we're defending Europe from a possible attack by Iran and North Korea. Okay, everybody knows that's a joke. Iran can't seriously threaten Europe. If North Korea ever launched nuclear weapons at Europe, which, by the way, these missile sites could not contain, North Korea would be destroyed. The point of these missile sites in Poland and Romania is clearly the dual-use purpose that these missile launchers there can be retrofitted to host offensive weapons targeting Russia, which is 5 minutes away from Russia. the New York Times acknowledged that essentially these sites are within 5-minute striking distance of Moscow. Imagine if Russia placed similar sites in Canada or anywhere in Latin America.
America was going to invade or nuclear strike Russia or not? Just be straight. Are you saying it? Because those are the two options. Either America invades or it strikes with nuclear weapons.
You're trying to avoid both
I'm going to talk now.
I'm going to talk now, okay? I do not think the U.S. is going to invade or launch nuclear strikes on Russia. I'm saying what they were doing was placing offensive weaponry, which they already done in Poland and Romania, and they wouldn't rule that out inside Ukraine. Already under Joe Biden accelerated a process called interoperability, where under the auspices of promising NATO membership to Ukraine one day, NATO was going to integrate Ukraine further into its military. That's why there were NATO trainers inside military, and NATO was placing a lot of weaponry inside of Ukraine. And Russia saw this as a threat to its security. There was a very pivotal phone call in late 2021 between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, where Putin asked Biden to rule out the placement of offensive weapons inside of Ukraine. And Joe Biden told him, according to the Kremlin, yes, we'll rule this out. But a few weeks later, the White House walked this back and said, actually, this is not an issue under discussion, as is the membership of Ukraine in NATO. We're not even going to discuss it. And that increased Russia's threat perception. U.S. would never tolerate similar weapon systems being placed inside Canada or Mexico. And you know that. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. I'm talking about offensive weapons like Tomahawk missiles that could still do damage to Russia and raise the threat of nuclear.
Have you not heard of the theory of mutual destruction?
I have heard of it, but the problem with what the U.S. was doing by placing these anti-missile defense sites in Poland and Romania that can be used for offensive strikes, and also, by the way, tearing up the INF Treaty, which is a really important Cold War pact, which Donald Trump, under the advice of John Bolton, walked away from in 2019, which that pact had eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. And by tearing up that pact, the U.S. was saying we're now free to now produce and place these intermediate range weapons that can threaten Russia. These were all threatening actions toward Russia. Russia was responding to those threats. That's my point here.
Aaron, my point is that because you keep sort of dancing around the straightforward answer is that America and Britain were clearly not going to either.
What am I dancing around?
Let me make my point. You've talked for a long time. Let me make my point. It's been absolutely clear, hasn't it, that America and its Western allies were not going to launch a land invasion of Russia. That's point one. You accept that, I think. It's also absolutely clear that America was not going to launch nuclear weapons unprovoked at Russia because the world would blow up. So these defenses and excuses and apologies for the invasion of Ukraine just burn away in your own waffle.
Let me ask Matt a question. Can I ask Matt one question? Matt, would you be okay with Russia placing Tomahawk missiles inside Ireland? Would you be okay with that?
They're not going to put weapons inside Ireland because the Irish government wouldn't allow it. It would make no difference to us, would it? Okay. It would make no difference to us.
If Russia helped overthrow the Irish government, install a Russian-friendly government in Ireland, would you be okay with Russia placing offensive missiles?
You're dealing with an absurd hypothesis.
That's exactly the hypothesis that happened in Ukraine.
Once again, by the way, you read something out. You read something out just now. And so this is much briefer than what you read out. Let me just remind everyone of who we're dealing with. This is Dmitry Medvedev, who is the president of Russia at a time when Putin gave sort of cursory glance to the Russian constitution because he couldn't continue to be president for another 4 years. Of course, since then, he's been president for many more years. And this is Dmitry Medvedev's response to the phone call yesterday between Trump and his boss, Putin. And it's only a few lines. The phone call between President Putin and Trump proved a well-known idea. There is only Russia and America in the dining room. On the menu, light appetizers, Brussels sprouts, British fish and chips, and Paris rooster. The main course is a Kiev-style cutlet. Enjoy your meal. These are the people we're dealing with, and you're wasting time trying to find excuses for why they invaded a sovereign and democratic country. It's pathetic.
Matthew, I'm going to ask you to try to play the issue and debate the issue rather than to personally attack my guest, because I think you're a better debater than that, actually. And I don't think it's a polite or productive thing to do. And one of the reasons that this conversation is so important is because it is interesting to people like me who sit in the media to realise that there are two sides to this debate. And we're not getting those two sides if you keep playing the man and not the ball.
But Aaron has spoken for every bit as long as I have. He's had every opportunity, Bev, to make his arguments. I'm responding to those arguments. And when I hear Russian propaganda, it offends me.
And he hasn't not once personally attacked you. He's not
what
trying to undermine.
If you want to personally attack me, feel free. What would you like to personally attack me about? I'm saying what the content of your argument is the sort of thing that will come out of the Kremlin, and I make no apology for saying that.
I would like a more grown-up conversation than slinging mud at the people, Matt, to be honest. And
I'm calling a spade, Bev.
But what I think is so interesting it comes back from that historical perspective, which Aaron has just laid out. Is this question that I asked you earlier. How far would be sufficiently far in terms of provocation for Russia to be justified in taking some sort of action against what they see as the West repeatedly posing threats upon them and their border? And I haven't been to Russia. I have no allegiance to the Russian people. I have a very clear understanding of President Putin as a man, of clearly swimming in a very murky sea of corruption and murder in that country, and has done since the moment that he became president, in fact. But should we always see that Russia have to tolerate different rules around geopolitics and power than any other country? Because that is effectively what we're seeing. That sounds like, Matt, what you're saying is there can never be too much provocation for Russia. And Putin, because he's an evil man, has to just accept it. What would be enough, or is there no line?
I'm glad for a start, Bev, that you've described Putin as a murderer, because that's entirely accurate. You're asking me to imagine a hypothetical scenario in which America aggressively goes to war with Russia. And I'm afraid I can't imagine that, because if America aggressively goes to war with Russia, all bets are off. Because guess what? We live in a world where America has an awful lot of nuclear weapons and Russia has an awful lot of nuclear weapons. In fact, Russia has even more nuclear weapons, as I understand it, than America. Mm-hmm. So the idea that the West are going to go to war in anything other than a defensive way is just, to use a word I used earlier, utterly absurd.
Under what circumstances would it be okay, therefore, for Russia to take action as in invading Ukraine? Is there no circumstance?
If Ukraine invaded Russia, like any other sovereign state, even though it's not a democracy, would be fully entitled to defend its borders.
Okay. Let's talk about...
Well, let me respond to this, because
Sorry, Aaron, go on.
This is the position that Russia was in, and we haven't really talked about it very much. So after the coup in 2014 of Yanukovych, you have, Russia takes Crimea. The new coup government, at the encouragement, by the way, of the CIA, John Brennan, then CIA director, flew to Kyiv and basically encouraged the new government to launch an attack on the Donbass, where you had a rebellion backed by Russia of people who didn't want to live under this new coup government that was waging an assault on Russian language and culture inside Ukraine. So you had a war going on there. It was very bloody. Russia intervened in that as well directly later on that year in 2014. Then you had something called the Minsk Accords, which was brokered by France and Germany, which would put an end to that war. And the basic premise of Minsk was that Ukraine would recognize limited autonomy for these breakaway regions of the Donbass, these ethnic Russians inside Ukraine who wanted to be able to speak the Russian language, wanted to be able to appoint their own judges, and wanted to have ties to Russia. That was the basic bargain of Minsk. And the unstated premise also was that Ukraine would not join NATO, because having this large autonomous region inside Ukraine would basically put an end to Ukraine's NATO aspirations. That's what Ukraine signed on to. The UN Security Council endorsed it, and that was supposed to end the war. Well, what happened was, again, the very vocal, powerful, numerically small but powerful ultranationalists and neo-Nazis inside Ukraine refused to allow this, because they didn't want to recognize any agreement that would grant ethnic Russians inside Eastern Ukraine a measure of equality and autonomy. So they revolted. They even threatened Volodymyr Zelensky's life when he was elected on a mandate of peace. He said, "I'm the president of peace. We're going to end this war." He had a huge mandate to do that. Well, far-right leaders from groups, including the right sector, literally threatened his life, and they marched in large numbers against any implementation of the Minsk Accords. And that led Zelensky to not implement them. And so in the final days before Russia invaded, Zelensky's government was saying, forget Minsk, it's never going to happen. And so Putin, sitting in Moscow, was faced with a situation where you have millions of people inside Ukraine who consider themselves ethnic Russians. They were still under assault, with the government in Ukraine saying there's no political compromise for them, and we're going to retake this territory by force. So Putin was under pressure for a very long time from even more hardline nationalists in his government to take action. And you did have, in the days before Russia invaded, an increase of shelling, according to international monitors, coming from the Ukraine side onto the Donbass side. That was the position that Putin was in. You had the U.S. refusing to take NATO off the table, and Zelensky saying, his government saying, we're never going to implement the Minsk Accords. And so Putin was under a lot of pressure, including from people inside the Donbass, to intervene. Now, I wish he had resolved this differently. I wish he had gone to the UN and said, we need peacekeepers for the Donbass. I wish he had made more of an issue out of this. There are things he could have done that were an alternative to war. But I'm saying is he invaded not because he wanted to colonize Ukraine, but because there was pressure on him to do something about the very real threat that existed to the people of the Donbass. Now, after this, and this is my final point, immediately after Russia invaded, there were peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Literally a few days after Russia invaded, they began, which shows to me that Russia was not bent on colonizing Ukraine. And they culminated in the Istanbul Accords of April 2022, when there was a very detailed agreement that was reached. It was recently published by the New York Times. And as one senior member of the Ukrainian team acknowledged, there was a compromise. Let me quote him. His name is Alexander Chali. He's a veteran Ukrainian diplomat. He was a part of that team. He said this: we managed to find a very real compromise. We were very close in the middle of April to finalize our war with some peaceful settlement. Putin tried to do everything possible to conclude an agreement with Ukraine. What happened to that agreement? We know now that Boris Johnson visited Zelensky in early April and told him that we're not going to back you up if you make an agreement with Russia. We're not going to give you the security guarantees that you need to conclude a peace deal with Russia. And we think you should fight him. We think you can win. And Zelensky, unfortunately, because he had no longer had the backing, he didn't have the backing of Boris Johnson or the US, and also facing the traditional threat that he faced from the hard right of Ukraine, he walked away. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of people have died.
How's Boris Johnson got away with that?
What a disgraceful thing to say. What a disgraceful thing to say. Let me set you straight immediately. The person who's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainians and tens of thousands of Russians is Putin. He invaded a sovereign country. Why do I have to keep saying this? You're seriously suggesting to me, Aaron, as a student of this area, apparently, that Putin doesn't consider Ukraine as part of Greater Russia. Are you seriously trying to rewrite history and tell our listeners and our viewers? Are you seriously trying to tell our listeners and our viewers, Aaron, that Russian tanks were not rolling on Kiev in 2022?
I didn't say they weren't. They were approaching Kyiv. They never tried to seriously take Kyiv away. But yes, they were approaching Kyiv. And
they never tried to take Kyiv. They got battered backwards. They got battered backwards by valiant Ukrainian soldiers. You're wobbling your head around. That's the reality.
But you've taken us off on a bit of a tangent, Matt. Boris Johnson has blood on his hands with this debate, because I have heard that from multiple sources. If you want to say Boris Johnson has blood on his hands, Boris Johnson is someone I criticise on a daily basis for month after month, year after year, nearly daily basis when he was Prime Minister. I thought he was an awful Prime Minister. If you want to accuse him of having blood on his hands as far as the Ukrainian war is concerned, please invite him on your show and challenge him to that, because I think that's quite a claim, and I think it's something he should be entitled to defend himself on. Could it be true? In your opinion, Matt, given that you have a low opinion of that man, as do I, could it be true, because this has been verified from multiple sources now, that the Istanbul Agreement was made and Boris Johnson flew in to Ukraine and effectively persuaded Zelensky this would be a bad idea? We don't know his true motivations for doing that. I'd love him to answer that particular question. If it's true, Matt, does it mean that this war has been prolonged for much longer, 2-3 years longer than it could have otherwise have been?
What is true, and what I know to be true, is that the person who's responsible for the deaths in Ukraine and the deaths of Russian soldiers is one man and one man alone, well, and his henchmen, and that's Putin. You're not going to get me to say anything else. If you want to skewer Boris Johnson, have the debate with Boris Johnson. The person who invaded Ukraine, whose tanks were rolling on Kiev, and let me correct Aaron on that and be absolutely clear, they were rolling on Kiev until they were pushed back and obliterated by Ukrainian defenses, as I imagine you would want America to be defended if America was being invaded, and as I'm sure we would defend Britain if Britain was being invaded. They were pushed back. They were heading for Kiev. And that's just reality. That's just history. And you can say anything you want. You can try to blame Boris Johnson for Putin's behavior. It doesn't wash with me. Challenge Boris Johnson. I've said what I've said.
Go on, Aaron.
Let me respond to that. You know, I'm not a military expert, admittedly, but if you look at the size of the force that Russia sent into Ukraine, that was not enough to take Kyiv or the whole country. It was about 80,000 troops, I believe, maybe even less. It's not enough to take a country, including Kyiv. I think Putin miscalculated. I think he thought, much like when the U.S. invaded Iraq, he'd be, greeted with flowers and adulation, and that Zelensky's government would quickly collapse. I think he made a huge miscalculation. I think he was misled by his own advisors, or he was
heading to Kiev. But you just think he was going to be welcomed. He thought he was going to be welcomed. You accept his tanks were heading for Kiev.
He certainly was headed to Kiev. I think he was trying to bring about the quick collapse of Zelensky's government. I think he failed at that. And I think especially when
Aaron called an illegal invasion.
I do call it an invasion. It was an invasion. I've always called it an invasion. I think especially once they realized that their plans for a quick collapse of Zelensky's government was going to fail, that's why they immediately pivoted to negotiations. And as I laid out, even Zelensky's one of his negotiators acknowledged they found a real compromise in Istanbul. And then, by the way, now
let me just see if we can find common ground.
Excuse me. Under whatever deal they get now, they're going to get far worse than what they could have gotten in Istanbul. They had a compromise in Istanbul, and Zelensky made the decision to walk away. Now, yes, you're right. Putin bears responsibility. He invaded, but Zelensky could have prevented so many deaths had he accepted the peace deal that his own negotiators brokered.
Matt.
Zelensky could have prevented deaths, I suppose, if he'd allowed the tanks to continue to Kiev. So it's to me a nonsense argument. The person who kept breaking, let me finish in my response, deal after deal after deal, is Putin. Now, let's see if we can find some common ground. And let's assume that you guys are both coming from a position where you're genuinely interrogating Western involvement in the build-up to war, and neither of you are apologists for Russia. So I'll take you for a moment on that basis. Although some of the things that Aaron has said,
anyway, carry on,
have sent to chill down my spine. But let's just say that we're all trying to deal in nothing more than analysis here. Okay. As I keep saying, it is absolutely reasonable to ask geopolitical questions and try to understand any role Western policy might have played in the build-up to war. What I think we should also agree is that none of that exonerates Putin. We all should agree that that was an illegal, unjustified invasion that has cost untold human suffering, not just amongst Ukrainians, but also amongst Russians. He is the sole person responsible for that. Has American and Western foreign policy made errors? If we assume for a second that despite being a clever and wily operator, Putin was deeply, deeply concerned and genuinely worried that NATO was going to invade, which I do not believe he was. But to the extent there might be even a grain of truth in that, it is right that we interrogate the way we approach the situation. I'm not saying we got it wrong, and Ukraine is a sovereign country, and if Ukraine wants to join NATO, it should be allowed to. But it's absolutely worth interrogating and analysing.
We've got Donald Trump now, obviously brokering this peace deal between these two countries. Do you see a time, Aaron, when Russia isn't always an adversary of the West? And what role does it play on the global stage to have Putin as a perpetual adversary to the West?
before I answer that, just to correct for the last time the straw man that Matthew keeps putting out. I'm not talking about a potential NATO invasion of Russia. I'm talking about Russia being threatened by NATO military infrastructure as a result of the expansion of NATO, including into possibly Ukraine, where you have offensive weapon systems.
No different.
So, I'm sorry.
No different.
A ground invasion is a lot different than offensive weapon systems.
Not if you accept that America wasn't going to strike Russia with nuclear weapons. Those are the only two options.
Okay. All right. So we're going to redo an earlier debate we already had. Let's not. Let me talk. I think offensive weaponry pointed at a country constitutes a threat. You apparently think that if Russia placed offensive missiles inside Ireland, that wouldn't be a threat to the UK. So we'll disagree.
Aaron, do you not understand the basics of this nuclear deterrent? If Russia wants to bomb America with nuclear weapons, it can already.
The point is, Matthew, what you understand, but you don't understand, if one country has a lot more military infrastructure surrounding another country and it's not equal, then that country has taken away the other country's deterrence. If there are offensive weapons inside Ukraine and other NATO states pointed at Russia, then the U.S. has a lot more deterrence against Russia than Russia has. Are you seriously saying
that Russia cannot strike American cities as it stands?
With nuclear weapons, they can. What I'm saying is, yes, they can. But if the U.S. has other weapon systems that are not nuclear pointed at Russia that can hit Russia within 5 minutes, you're going to take away also Russia's deterrence and also raise the threat perception. Why would we want to increase the threat and the risk of a nuclear war breaking out? The whole point when you have two nuclear states is to minimize the risk, not raise it. That's why it was folly for the U.S. to walk away from the INF Treaty, to walk away from the ABM Treaty, to walk away from the Open Skies Treaty, and to expand NATO, a hostile military alliance to Russia's border. Now, let me get to the question that was...
Just one slice, because you've got to follow it through logically. Under what circumstances are you suggesting that the United States president, whoever that might have been, was going to authorize strikes on Moscow with the weapons that you're referring to?
We've had that conversation. I just want to...
We haven't. Aaron hasn't given me the scenario. He's just said that Russia is legitimately paranoid.
I think the parallel about... I mean, I would feel quite paranoid if we had Russian missiles on the coast of Ireland pointing in our direction, and we know categorically what the British government would do that.
From time to time, their planes buzz around in our airspace, as I understand it. We are legitimately concerned about Russia without them having weapons in Ireland.
Let me ask this question, though, Aaron, if I could just revisit the question. What role does it play on the global stage to have Putin as the perpetual evil character in this war games play that is always at work across the world? And what happens if he's brought in and they say, okay, you know what? We're going to trade with you. We're going to work with you. You have the biggest landmass. You have so many mineral resources. You don't even have enough resources to mine all of your fantastic natural abundance resources that we need in the 21st century. What happens across the world if we cooperate with Russia?
Well, going back to your introduction, if you no longer have this boogeyman, this foreign threat, that means you can actually take care of your needs at home. You can, I live in the US where millions of people don't have health care, where infrastructure needs a lot of work. And rather than spending tens of billions of dollars on weaponry that can be funneled into Ukraine for a proxy war, or building up a new nuclear arsenal, or all of the things that are spent on weapons of war, we can actually take care of our needs at home. And same thing with Europe. There's going to be a lot of pain now in Europe, as you talked about, as a result of this proxy war, because so much money has been diverted into fighting this boogeyman. And my point is, you don't have to like Putin. You don't have to accept his invasion of Ukraine. I agree that it was illegal. But there are reasonable compromises on the table. They were reached in Istanbul already by Ukrainian negotiators before Boris Johnson and the U.S. stood in the way. So if we took away this boogeyman, just like if we took away all foreign boogeymen over the years, in my lifetime, there's been Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. There's always someone we can point to and say, this is the new embodiment of Hitler. This is the new evil. This is why we have to take away money for pensions and hospitals and spend it on war. If we took that away, we actually could have a cooperative world where people's needs are met, and we weren't sacrificing so many lives just to weaken geopolitical adversaries, which, by the way, was the open aim of the Biden administration. That they very quickly admitted the goal was not to defend Ukraine. It was to weaken Russia. And that's because Russia is a geopolitical adversary that can challenge U.S. hegemony.
Go on,
that's
Matt.
why this whole thing.
There are some assertions there. Okay, there are some assertions, and I'm no spokesman for Biden. But just to be clear for listeners and viewers, your assertion is that Biden's motivation was to weaken Russia rather than to defend a sovereign and democratic ally. Okay, so if Biden were here, he'd be better able to answer that. You talk about a proxy war. This is a war for the defense of a sovereign democracy within Europe. And you talk about a bogeyman. Putin's not a bogeyman. He's an evil, murdering dictator who wipes out his opposition. And if you were a spokesman for Putin, by the way, he'd probably murder you in 3 days' time once you stop being useful to him. So we need to be absolutely clear about the language, guys, because the language here really matters.
Let's be clear. I'm going to quote you somewhere. If Ukraine falls, it will be a disaster for the West. This will put an end to Western hegemony. Okay? Who said that? Boris Johnson, your own former prime minister. He also acknowledged that this was a proxy war too. In another interview, he said, this is a proxy war. So Boris Johnson has the honesty to acknowledge that this is a proxy war for Western hegemony. You should join him rather than try to insult people.
Guys, it's perfectly reasonable, so long as you're getting your facts right, to throw whatever mud you want at Boris Johnson. Again, you're allowed to do that in a democracy.
I'm quoting him. I'm not throwing mud. Excuse me, I'm not throwing mud. I'm quoting Boris Johnson. It would be better if he were here. Kremlin propaganda. I'm actually saying that Western officials, including Boris Johnson, admit this. The Biden administration, Lloyd Austin said, our goal is to weaken Russia.
The problem is
reprimanded him for saying the truth. Because we're supposed to say this is all about democracy and freedom.
But the problem is that Boris Johnson's not here to defend himself. But let me tackle this issue of the peace dividend.
Just Matthew, I'd love to see Boris Johnson. I would love to see Boris Johnson debate a Russia expert. We'll never see it. Okay. We'll never see it, Matt. Right. You know that man would not sit there and take on somebody with a depth of knowledge.
And I wasn't attacking Boris Johnson, quoting him.
All I know about Boris Johnson is that, in my view, he was a dreadful prime minister. But let's talk about the peace dividend, because this is really important. Boris Johnson is thankfully no longer our prime minister. We're hearing a lot about the peace dividend, which is effectively what Aaron seems to be alluding to. But he wants a peace dividend moving forward. The problem with a peace dividend, which we thought we were able to enjoy at the end of the Cold War, and precisely cut defense spending and invest in all the things that Aaron has just been talking about, which in an ideal world we would all love, not least me, because I see millions of my fellow citizens languishing on NHS waiting lists. The point about the peace dividend is that Aaron's president, because you're an American citizen, you say, is basically saying, well, you shouldn't have had the peace dividend. What you should have been doing is spending properly on NATO. And so as a direct consequence of what Donald Trump has been saying in recent weeks and the threats that he's been making to allies effectively, is that we should be spending more, not less, on our defense. So do you disagree with President Trump, Aaron, when he says that European countries, including Bev and my own Britain, should be spending more on defense, which presumably means spending less on the things that you've just name-checked?
Of course, I disagree with Trump that we should be spending more on the military-industrial complex. I think if we were serious about, diplomacy, there could be agreements reached not just with Russia, but other U.S. adversaries that could reduce the threat of war and free up money to spend on the people rather than war profiteering. So absolutely, I disagree with Trump. It's not even a question.
How much of Ukraine would you be prepared to give up, Aaron? Would you have been prepared to give up Kiev?
Okay, first of all,
the peace dividend. For the peace dividend, so we can spend more money on our healthcare. Spend more money on our healthcare system. Would you have been prepared to give up Kiev?
Now this is a straw man because Russia's never demanded that Kyiv be handed over in any peace talks.
Russia invaded Ukraine and its tanks headed for Kyiv.
Yes.
So those are facts. Yes. Those are my facts. Should Ukraine have folded? Should we have given them no weapons to help defend themselves, given up Kiev, and then spent more money on our healthcare systems? Is that what you're saying?
If you want to pretend that history began when Russia invaded, then
I'm not answering my question directly, Aaron. Come on.
So what I'm saying is the history didn't begin when Russia invaded, and the problem is, which you haven't addressed, you do have millions of people inside Ukraine who consider themselves to be ethnic Russian, the people of the
What's
Donbass.
the answer to my question? What's the answer to my question?
Okay, so of course Kyiv should not go to Russia. That would be unacceptable.
Right.
Of course not.
But what should go to Russia?
But in terms of what should have been done when Russia invaded, the U.S. should have, rather than blocking diplomacy, rather than blocking the Minsk Accords, which preceded Russia's invasion, and then the Istanbul Accords, which followed the Russian invasion, the U.S. should have said, yes, we're going to give Ukraine the security guarantees it needs to reach this peace deal with Russia, rather than have Boris Johnson go over and say, don't reach a peace deal. We're not going to back you up. We're not going to give you
done when the tanks rolled in. Aaron. Should America not have been spending money on defense, but should it have been spending more money on healthcare so that and just allow Kiev to be overrun and allow the whole of Ukraine to become a proxy state or indeed
it doesn't have to be that black and white, though.
You can't have a peace dividend when you have Putin in the Kremlin.
If you want to start the clock properly, what the U.S. should have done is say, we're not going to try to bring Ukraine into NATO, which, by the way, most Ukrainians didn't even want. And we're also not going to destabilize a country, back the overthrow of a president, and then support a proxy war in the Donbass after 2014. That's what the U.S. should have done. And had the U.S. done that, you never would have had a Russian invasion. Had the U.S. said to Ukraine,
how do you know that? Have you been chatting to Vladimir Putin? How do you know that?
It's true. It's a counterfactual now, but it's so obvious.
True. It's counterfactual.
And by the way, I quote you many people. Okay, I quote you many people. Jack Matlock, who was the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, he said the exact same thing. It's so obvious. There was a war going on in Ukraine for 8 years before Russia invaded. I wish they hadn't. But if you want to be blind to our role in provoking it, that you're not being someone act. That you're not acting.
I'm just holding your toes to the fire.
I just want to look forward.
Yeah.
What happens now, Matthew? Let me come to you first. In terms of a peace agreement, what would be satisfactory, do you think, for Ukraine, but also for the Russian people? For all those mothers whose sons are dragged off the streets in both countries to go and fight in that war, what would be a suitable compromise?
The only person who is responsible for the Russian mothers. I'm answering your question because you've built in an assumption. I'm coming to the Ukrainian perspective in a moment, but you brought Russian mothers into it.
And Ukrainian mothers.
I have a lot of empathy for Russian mothers and fathers, by the way, and brothers and sisters and girlfriends and boyfriends. And by the way, unlike you, Bev, I have been to Russia, and I questioned that decision. I went to Russia in, I think, early 2017, and I wanted to experience
I'd like to go, but as a journalist, Matthew, if I went to Russia, the next time you'd be on my show in Britain's Newsroom, you'd be saying, well, why did you go to Russia? Why did you go to Russia? There would raise suspicion as a broadcaster if I went to Russia.
So I'm just being open. I went to Russia in 2017, and that was after the invasion of the Crimea in 2014. So you could perfectly reasonably say I shouldn't have gone to Russia. I went to Russia to experience something of it for myself. And that's perfectly open to question as to whether I should have done or not. But it was an interesting experience. And by the way, I do not blame the Russian people for what their president has forced them into, particularly because they don't have a free media. So they don't understand, other than if their sons have been killed, what's actually going on here. So I have a lot of empathy for Russian mothers and fathers, but the only person on this planet who is responsible for their suffering is Vladimir Putin. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I can't speak for Ukraine because I'm not Ukrainian. Ultimately, it is for them to decide what they are prepared to compromise on. They've accepted, haven't they already, that they cannot regain the territories that they've lost through military means. But quite understandably, they're not going to recognize them as sovereign Russian territory. I don't know where the lines exactly are. They're going to have to make some compromises, it seems. They're open to making some compromises. The person who doesn't appear to be, as we know from the conversation that happened yesterday and the attacks that happened on Ukraine after that conversation, maybe even during it, is Vladimir Putin.
You see, I don't even know what to believe about what's happened since that ceasefire was triggered, because the press have gone strangely silent, bizarrely, and I do a daily news show. You know, Ukraine is on the front page of the papers until it looks like Donald Trump might have brokered a peace deal, and then it strangely drops away from the news agenda. I don't know why that is.
Which ceasefire are you referring to? Because at the moment there's conversation about an extremely limited ceasefire about energy infrastructure.
That is exactly what I'm talking about. This idea that both countries agreed to a ceasefire, particularly against energy sources. And then we're seeing headlines that has been breached by both sides. But it is very difficult in a media that appears never to have presented any nuance in this particular
Not both sides, Bev.
relationship.
Russia attacked Ukraine yesterday and Ukraine then responded.
I have seen no evidence of, if you have evidence of that, apart from a headline on a website, I would love to see it, because I've been trawling through social media. Normally in these things, when people break ceasefires, we saw it in Gaza and Israel.
There isn't a ceasefire, as I understand it. There isn't actually a ceasefire. There's talk of this ceasefire of energy infrastructure, but Russia attacked. So, I mean, look at President Zelensky's feed. Choose whether to believe that or not.
Yeah. Okay, Aaron, what does peace look like? From your point of view, what would be a satisfactory compromise, do you think, on the behalf of Ukraine? And what would feel like a semi-victory, let's say, for Putin, who we have to remember also has people, his own people, looking at how he comes out of this. And as we know, he will not want to lose any sort of respect for his population.
Peace will look a lot worse than what it looked like in Istanbul in April 2022, when Ukraine and Russia reached a deal that the US and UK undermined. That deal would have let Ukraine keep all of its territory except for Crimea and the Donbass, which would have been the subject of follow-up talks between directly Putin and Zelensky. Ukraine will not get that now. Ukraine is going to lose territory to Russia. Russia is not going to give up a lot of the territory that it's taken. How much, I don't know. And it's just a tragedy. It's too bad. And for me, being in the West, I put the responsibility on our government, who stood in the way of the peace deal that Ukrainian and Russian negotiators reached back in April 2022. So what the specifics look like, I don't know, but it's going to be a lot worse for Ukraine. I do think, though, it's better than continuing on the current course, which is sacrificing all these people in Ukraine, by the way, mostly lower class Ukrainians, working class Ukrainians. There's horrible footage of Ukrainian men being basically kidnapped from the streets, being forced off to fight.
Here we go. Here we go. That's not true. That's alternative fact. They weren't kidnapped and sent online. No, this is fake news.
I didn't interrupt.
Aaron,
okay.
News.
I'll post the video. I'll post the video, and you can refute it if you want to. I'll post the video online, and you can refute it if you want to.
That's been debunked, as far as I understand it. That's people who are draft dodgers, Aaron, who are draft dodgers being arrested. That's different from being kidnapped and sent to the front line. And by the way, you talked to me, Bev, about personal insults. There's political debate, and I'm sure if we were in a green room, we'd all get on perfectly well after the debate. I think that's actually very important. But these things really matter because they're a matter of truth, they're a matter of life and death, and they're the matter of an invasion by a murderous dictator of a sovereign democracy. And so listening to Aaron peddle this nonsense, the state that has been kidnapping people is the Russian state under Vladimir Putin that has been kidnapping Ukrainian children, for goodness sake. And Aaron wants us, our listeners, to focus on draft dodgers being arrested. It's just sickening.
Those images, hang on, Aaron, hang on. Matt, those images of what you call draft dodgers, I would say are young men that don't want to go to war and are being seized from the street to be taken to war. For time countries work, Bev. It's how it would have worked. So is it okay? Is it okay?
They were at war with Germany.
Hang on, one at a time.
If Matthew wants to support sending young Ukrainians who don't want to fight off to die, that's his prerogative. My point is, I think that it's a much better solution to have some kind of peace deal that retains what's left and what's possible of the Istanbul Agreement, which, by the way, the Trump administration has talked about reviving. I think that's a better alternative than sending more young people off to die, whether they want to sacrifice themselves or not.
It's outrageous. Every war that you can think of. If you think of the Second World War, you had conscription. You didn't have conscription for the Iraq War. It wasn't required. And we weren't ourselves directly under threat. And again, we can debate the rights and wrongs of the Iraq War and Western foreign policy. But to start attacking Ukraine for having conscription, which is the most basic thing a state does when it comes under a direct attack, is just outrageous.
Matt, how old is your... Hang on, Matthew, how old is your oldest child?
Well, here we go. Here's the next question. Am I prepared to see my children become peacekeepers? They're unlikely, though they may do, and if they want to join the army, I'll support it. They're unlikely to join the army. They're 2 and they're 8 weeks old. But
Correct.
if we ever get to a position, Bev, let's cut to the chase. If they ever get to the position of having to defend of Britain being under attack, then of course I would support their subscription, their conscription rather.
Wow.
And I hope very much that I would be conscripted myself if Britain comes under attack, because I'm very proud of my country. And my grandfather, by the way, won the Military Cross for his role in the D-Day landings, going up to the enemy lines, the German lines in France, paving the way amongst many millions of others for our continent and for our countries to be free countries, along with the help, the very, very important help.
Well,
the
I'll tell you what I hope,
Aaron's country, America.
I tell you what I hope, because I have a 21-year-old son and I have teenage girls who, if this conflict carries on being pushed forward in the way that the EU particularly and Keir Starmer seem to want it to do without any sort of resolution, I would really hope there are a lot of conversations going on in the media like this to demonstrate that war is not simple. It isn't black versus white. And if I felt the principle of sending my children to the front line was wrong, I would stand in front of the door and I would rather be shot than my children dragged out of a car to go and defend their country. And I would suspect that you will too.
Not about to conscript your 21-year-old son, Bev, so stop being alarmist, because it's just not happening.
You're right, it's not happening, even if they try. And I would say to Keir Starmer,
no
there's your teenage son. Let's see your teenage son go first.
You're creating straw men, and Aaron is sort of half smiling. You know it's nonsense, and you shouldn't attempt to frighten or manipulate your listeners and viewers into pretending otherwise.
It's not nonsense, because we are talking about sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, which is going to put British soldiers in that area, which can become a conflict zone.
It will only happen with an American security backstop, Bev, as you know. It will only happen if Trump gives a security guarantee, which at the moment he's not prepared to do. So this is very distant, but the people who will be going are people who are professional soldiers. And when you're a professional soldier, it kind of works like that. Your prime minister, your government decides to send you into to work in a certain situation, and I have nothing but respect for the British Armed Forces who do sign up voluntarily,
100%.
Bev, in a democracy.
100%. But that conversation started because of pictures of young men being dragged off the streets and into the backs of cars that we've all seen, and that you can't present any evidence that are false. You can't present any evidence that those pictures are false.
You can't draft dodge when your country is under attack. That's what happens.
Gentlemen, we have to wind it up there. I really appreciate your contributions, because there are not enough of these conversations. There haven't been enough of these conversations while this whole conflict is going on, where we bring two minds together who see things very differently and we try to get somewhere. I'm not sure we did get anywhere, but we are all agreed on the fact that we would like less war, I think, and we would like more.
We want peace. We want peace. The question is how to get there.
We do. Right, Aaron Maté, Matthew Stadlen, thank you so much for joining me.